Mike, in understanding the Christian God, one of the first things you face is the Trinity, and the Trinity looks like three, and it could even be four. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then you have a combination of all four, and this is one God. Many different explanations about how that occurs. What's your favorite?
I like to talk about this in terms of analogies. This is how, in Sunday school and in church, people are, they're always trying to explain the doctrine of the Trinity with an analogy. And the trick here, sort of the holy grail of Trinitarian theology, is to find an analogy that isn't going to move too far in the direction of saying that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are just one thing, right, and not too far in the direction of saying that they're three things, right? So the heresies you want to avoid, one's called modalism, which basically says, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are kind of like Bruce Wayne and Batman, right? I mean, just different appearances of the same guy. Right. The other one is polytheism. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are they're just three separate beings. I'll give you two popular analogies and the one I like, right? So one analogy says, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are like the three phases of water. Water could be ice, it could be liquid, it could be vapor. And Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are like that. What I want to say is that's...
that sounds like the modalism.
That's the modalism, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are just different appearances of one and the same thing. The other analogy is, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are like... This is C.S. Lewis's analogy. They're like six faces of a cube, right? A cube it's one cube, but six faces. Right. Well, the six faces are just six different things, and they're parts of the cube. So this says Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are parts of God, and I think that's just polytheism. Here's the analogy I like. Suppose I take a piece of clay and I make a statue of Gumby. Then I ask you, what's the relationship between Gumby and the piece of clay? And you might say, well, they're the same thing. But I say, oh, no, look, that piece of clay existed before Gumby. Something can't exist before itself, right? So they're different. Are they two different things? If I'm going to sell it, can I sell you Gumby and then charge you extra for the piece of clay? No, right? This is a puzzle that philosophers have argued about for years. Sure. Millennia. The solution I like says, well, here's the relationship between Gumby and the piece of clay. They are the same, but not identical. They're one. This is the way Aristotle put it. They're one in number, but not one in being. They share the same matter, and where you have two things sharing the same matter, you count one material object. Mm-hmm. Right? This is just how we count. Right? If you think about it, that is how it goes, right? You can find, this is a case of material constitution, and you can find material constitution all over the place, right? You and the collection of particles that compose you, you're not two things, right? Or you're maybe two things, but you're not two separate material objects, you and this heap of particles. You're just, where we find things sharing the same matter, we count one material object, even though we could still make a distinction, right? My fist and my hand, right? There's one object here, but the fist goes away when I open my hand. The hand doesn't go away. So in some sense, they're two separate things. Right. This relationship is all over the place. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I want to say, the shared, I don't really mean that this is matter, but I want to say the shared matter is the divine nature, right? And this is Aristotelian terminology, the form or the property that makes for the differences are these properties, you could call them being the Father, being the Son, being the Holy Spirit, or unbegottenness in the case of the Father, begottenness in the case of the Son, spiration in the case of the Spirit. But they are, and their relationship is analogous to the fist in the hand or Gumby in Gumby and the piece of clay.
The fact that they are centers of consciousness, I think that's a fair term. I haven't wandered into a heresy by saying that, have I?
It depends a little on who you ask, but I think that's fine.
Okay, because I'm in this subject, I'm easily tripping on heresies that I seem to gravitate towards. So if they're each centers of consciousness, it sounds like that is a differentiating factor between the clay and the Gumby. If they have independent centers of consciousness, because they obviously do, because the Son talks about the Father. I mean, they are independent in that sense. It sounds like that undermines the argument that they're all made of the same. They have the same nature, but that sounds very amorphous. The clay was very substantive. I hate to use substance, but the clay was substantive, and it's all the same clay and Gumby clay. I mean, you really see that. But I think when you get to when each one becomes a center of consciousness, and then that the claim is that they're all the same stuff, if you in any sort of real sense, I think that's problematic.
Yeah. First of all, even though this is kind of the way the analogy's going, I don't think the divine nature is literally stuff, right? So there's that. Okay. I do want to affirm that there is different consciousness there. The tradition says that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share a will, and they share an agency, but I think if they're going to be distinct persons, it has to be the case that the Father thinks things like, I am the Father and not the Son, right? The Son thinks things like, I'm the Son and not the Father. Right. The Son thinks, I do the will of the Father, right? And in thinking that, isn't thinking, I'm just doing my own will, right? Even though they share a will. Right. And I guess the way I want to respond to the claim that it seems that they can't be distinct centers of consciousness and stand in this kind of relation I'm talking about is just to say, I don't see an argument for that conclusion, right? It's a sort of bare intuition. Yeah. It's very different from the, I think, very well-grounded intuition that you can't have, X, Y, and Z that are literally distinct and the same identical thing, right? That's a set of intuitions that'll lead you to a contradiction. So the view I'm offering says, hey, sameness isn't identity. Just as you get the same material object when you have two things that share the same matter, so too you get the same God when you have two divine beings that share a divine nature. And then if you say, well, but how could those beings have different centers of consciousness? I think I'm within my rights to say, I don't know, but I also don't see an argument for the conclusion that they can't.
And right? Do you have a name for this theory?
It's ended up being called Constitution Trinitarianism because it draws an analogy with material constitution. Material constitution is the relationship between two things that share all of their material parts in common.